As we look around at our capital and our nation, it's easy to see that there are many challenges that our leaders are facing today. Challenges that are unique for our times, but I think you would agree that the last decade has been filled with these unprecedented and complex issues unlike ever before. Issues that our leaders are now working to resolve, issues which require maximum flexibility and out-of-the-box thinking. They bring a new complexity that demand our leaders possess leadership attributes that equip them to face and, more importantly, solve these 21st century challenges. Our guest speaker today is just such one of those leaders. General George Casey, the 36th Chief of Staff, United States Army, retired, led what is arguably the world's largest and most complex organization, the United States Army. 1.1 million people strong, with a budget of over $200 billion. He led it during one of the most extraordinary periods in our modern military and global political history. Prior to becoming the Army Chief of Staff, he commanded all multinational forces in Iraq during the most turbulent period in the past decade. During his leadership tenure in the country, Iraq transitioned to a sovereign government, held 3 elections, and reconstituted its army and national police force. Each of these national level and transformative tasks required extraordinary understanding and vision in so many varied disciplines. It's no surprise that after almost 3 years commanding U.S. forces in Iraq, the President selected General Casey to lead our Army, and when he assumed that responsibility, the Army was stretched from over 6 years of continuous war. Over his tenure, he stabilized and transformed the Army to meet the challenges of the 21st century while continuing to meet the demands of 2 wars. General Casey transformed a highly trained Army, which was trained and prepared for conventional war, to an agile force more suited to today's challenges and a far more complex environment. Ladies and gentlemen, General George Casey.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Nice to be here. My mother would have loved that introduction. Thank you very much. I'd like to talk to you a little bit this morning about leadership. And I see, there's a nice mix of folks here. I can see folks with my hair color and folks with darker hair color, and that's great. Because leadership applies at every level of every organization. And it's not someone else's challenge, it's the leader's challenge to make things work. About right before Christmas, I got a call from the dean of the business school at the University of North Carolina. And they said, General, would you come down here and talk about leadership in a VUCA environment? And I said, yes, of course. And I hung up and I Googled VUCA. Because even though I had heard it and I knew it was something about complexity and stuff, I'd forgotten. Well, I was even more chagrined to find out that it was a term coined by the Army War College in the late 90s to describe what the world would look like after the fall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I said to myself, wow, I've seen that environment. I saw it in Bosnia. I saw it in Kosovo. And boy, did I ever see it in Iraq. When I got to Iraq in July of 2004, and Iraq was a volatile place. One day we were occupying Iraq. The next day we had granted sovereignty back to the Iraqi government, and there was an Iraqi government nominally in charge. And while we were going through the process to make that hugely significant change, a young Marine made a wrong turn in the holy city of Najaf, drove too close to a militia leader's house, and a fight erupted that rapidly spread across the southern part of the country. And so in the first 30 days, we saw that things were going to change. they were going to change quickly, and they were going to change for reasons that were completely beyond our control. And as I go through these examples from Iraq, think about your own environment. And I suspect in Washington, D.C., there's a little volatility in what you do on a daily basis. Was Iraq an uncertain place? Sure was. What was probably most uncertain in those early days was our outcome. And we went in there with a view that we needed to guide Iraq through an 18-month process where they would have an election to elect a parliament to write a constitution, write the constitution, approve it, and then have another election to elect a government based on that constitution. 18-month process. But I can tell you, as the ambassador and I wrestled with trying to come to grips with the situation on the ground, that outcome in those early days was very uncertain. And frankly, in today's environment, whether it's in the business world or the security world, if you have anything where the outcome is certain, buy it. But they're going to be few and far between. Complexity. Iraq was the most complex environment that I have ever had to operate in. And not only did the ambassador and I have to respond to our own government, we were in a relationship of what they call partnership with an Iraqi government. We had at that time 33 coalition partners whose interests needed to be taken into account. And we had to take into account all of the different Iraqi factions who were vying for interests. It was the most complex environment I'd ever operated in. And it was that way because in every decision that we had to make, we had to consider multiple and competing internal and external variables. And it was mind-boggling. And again, nothing's easy in Washington. After finishing up in the Pentagon, there's a level of complexity there too. But it's something we're all going to have to get used to deal with. And finally, ambiguity. You would expect things to be ambiguous in war. The enemy is actively out there trying to keep you from finding out about them. What I didn't expect is that there would be ambiguity in how the Iraqi government saw things and how the ambassador and the embassy saw things. And so on every issue, we had multiple interpretations of what the circumstances meant. And nothing was clear. So Iraq was a pretty VUCA environment. But the Pentagon is only slightly better. And I would say that the environment, the business environment today, the global business environment, is pretty VUCA. And so I think, even though the term was developed in the late 90s, I think VUCA is as relevant today as it was then. And so what I'd like to talk to you about today is the kind of leadership that it takes to succeed in a VUCA environment. Now, we entered the war on terror after September 11th with a very good 21st century Army and Marine Corps, Navy, and Air Force. Our armed forces were very good. And we transformed those armed forces over the course of the next 7 to 10 years while we were fighting a war. And that took a certain set of skills, and those are the skills that I'd like to talk to you about today. I'm going to talk to you about the character traits that leaders need to have in this environment: vision, courage, and character. And then I'm going to talk to you about the 6 areas where I have found are the high payoff areas for leaders. The areas where if the leaders focus their precious intellectual and emotional energy, the outcomes will have the highest payoff for the organization. And I'll tell you, one of the things I found was that people tend to gravitate toward what they know rather than gravitate toward the important things. And so I'll talk to you about those things. All in favor? Yeah. Okay, good. Vision, courage, and characters. People always ask me, General, when you were picking the Army's generals, what did you look for? And those were the three things. I look for leaders that had the vision to look to the future, the courage to see opportunities and challenges, and the character to act and bounce back in difficult situations. Vision. You know, what is vision? And I've been scratching around with this for a while, and the best definition I've found so far is the foresight to see something in a future environment, something of significance that other people don't see. And sure, a lot of it is intuitive. But I looked for leaders that had wide interests, that weren't narrowly focused. And I looked for leaders that tended to look more outside their organization than inside the organization. Because the big changes are going to come at you from outside. They're not going to come at you from inside. And what I told my generals was the higher up you go, the more the keys to your success lie outside your organization. So the more the leader needs to focus their time and energy outside the organization rather than inside. Inside's what you know. It's easy to go back in there and do that job that you used to do better than the guy that's in it now. But that's not helping the organization, and you're probably pissing off the people below you. So, vision. Now, because vision and stating requirements for the future requires us to make judgments about the future, something that we as human beings aren't very good at. What did Yogi Bear say? Predictions are hard, especially when you're talking about the future. It takes courage to act. And you must act to succeed. Thank you, Tom. You have to act and succeed. And what I found, that in this VUCA environment that was Iraq and that was Washington, people became flummoxed by the complexity. And the environment became a reason not to act. And you have to act to succeed. And that takes courage. Nothing good happens without risk. Again, if you find something that people say this is no risk, buy it. But so far, I haven't found anything like that. So it takes courage to lead, to act in the face of all this volatility and uncertainty and ambiguity. And that takes character. I remember I used to have a quote from Sun Tzu that I kept on my desk in Iraq, and when I was the chief. But it said, leaders must, I'm paraphrasing, leaders must be pure of mind, because the decisions they make will be so difficult. And he's talking about leaders in war. I would tell you the same thing applies to leaders in any time. And in a VUCA environment, the issues will stretch you. And if you don't go in there with a strong set of values, you can get sucked down the wrong track very, very easily. So I look for leaders that had strong character, that led their organizations, that lived their values and set the examples. And that bred trust within the organization. If you think about the leaders that you respected, what was it about them? They were men and women of character. You knew that when the going got tough, they'd do the right thing, not for themselves, they'd do the right thing for the company. And that trust is the glue that binds organizations together, and that trust comes from the character of the leader. So, in my mind, 3 prerequisites for leaders in the 21st century: vision, courage, and character. Now, switching to the places, the 6 high payoff areas where leaders can and should focus their time and energy to help their organizations be most successful in these environments. I'll just tick them off, and then I'll go back and hit each one individually. First of all, developing vision and strategy. Second, building consensus for that vision and that strategy. Third, building the team to execute. Fourth, identifying opportunities and driving change. Fifth, communicating. And lastly, taking care of yourself. And I'll give you some examples as I go through these. Developing vision and strategy. The number one question that I asked in Iraq, and the number one question I continued to ask as Chief of Staff of the Army, was, what are we really trying to accomplish? No kidding. What are we really trying to accomplish here? And what I found was, the higher up I went, the harder it became for me to answer that question with clearly and succinctly. Yet the more important it was that I do that, because believe me, nothing got clearer when it left the four-star headquarters and started trickling down through about 12 layers of the chain of command. It only got more complex and confusing. And so we spent an awful lot of time in Iraq and in the Pentagon trying to be very, very clear about what it was we wanted the Army to accomplish. And the Army has a pretty good process to help leaders find the solutions to difficult and complex problems. And we published it in our major operational manual. And it's in the section under Commander's Role in Battle Command, but it gives you a construct called understand, visualize, describe, and direct. And I have found that thinking your way, forcing yourself to follow this process, is a good way to help you frame solutions to hard problems, and framing a clear vision is one of the hardest problems that you'll encounter. Understand. The leader has to build a level of understanding far beyond what anybody else in the organization understands. And what I found continuously is those insights, the key leap-ahead insights that will give the leader the clarity they need, usually come from outside the organization, not inside the organization. And so, as I took over the job as Chief of Staff of the Army, I thought my vision was going to be something fancy, like America's Army, an agile, disciplined warrior team, dominant across the spectrum of 21st century conflict. Right? What did it tell you to do? What did I say I wanted you to accomplish? And so I started building my understanding. I came out of Iraq. I told Secretary Gates, I'm going to need 60 days to unwind after almost 3 years here and to get my head in the game for the Army. He said, fine. I put together a little transition team, and I sent folks out all across the Army. And I had one group that said, tell me the state of the Army today, and I had another group that said, tell me the state of the Army, or what we want the Army to look like in the future. And they went back all over the Army, and they came back and they gave me feedback. Meanwhile, I'm going around Washington, and I'm talking to experts. I'm talking to people from the other services, and I'm just trying to get a view of how people outside see the Army. And then I'm doing a lot of reading and stuff that now you can imagine the size of the briefing books that they give you. I mean, needed a footlocker just to carry them around. But lots of work to build my level of understanding. The second step, though, is visualization. And the leader needs to be able to not only see where they are, but see where they want to go. And that takes a higher level of understanding. And what I've always found was that for me to get that higher level of clarity, I had to go out and get on the ground and talk with people at every level of the organization. So in those first 4 months, my wife and I hit the road and visited soldiers, civilians, families, units all over the world. And we drew input from every level of the organization. And what I began to see was that here is an army stretched by 6 years of war, looking at another 5 to 10 years in the face. And the families that we talked to were the most brittle part of the force. And then toward the middle of that 4-month period, I began saying to myself, wow, we have a 40-year investment in an all-volunteer force here, and if we don't do something to get this back on track, we're going to have a significant challenge. So I came back and I began describing, that's the third step, describing. I began describing how I saw the situation in the field to my key subordinates and to my key staff. And as I described it more and more, I got a greater clarity in my own thinking. And I find that developing a clear vision is like sharpening a pencil. You start off with a flat, we still have number 2 pencils now, don't we? You start off with a flat thing, and it keeps getting sharper. And it's iterative. Don't be disappointed when you don't sit down to write a vision statement and it doesn't come to you like that. This took 4 months for me to see it with a level of clarity that I was comfortable enough to go out then and do the 4th step, which is direct the Army to do it. Now, what did I come up with? Not America's Army, an agile, disciplined warrior team. I said, I want to put the Army back in balance. That the Army was out of balance, so weighed down by the current commitments, we couldn't do the things we needed to do to sustain the force and prepare for the future. Put the Army back in balance. And everywhere I went, inside and outside the Army, I was Mr. Balance. I say, oh no, here comes Casey again. I'm going to have to hear about the balance. But that's what we did. And it came out of that process. Understand, visualize, describe, direct. But just figuring out what you want to do isn't enough. You have to be just as clear about how you want to do it. And that's where the strategy comes in. And I'm telling you this because the leader needs to be directly involved in the formulation of the vision and the strategy. Anybody, how many of y'all work in the Pentagon? Few? In the government? Okay, you must see the same thing, but you can walk into the Pentagon any time of day or night and you'll find 4 colonels standing on a corner saying, there's no vision for this, there's no strategy for that. And I always ask them, I said, why? Because it's hard. I said, it was easy, you guys would figure it out. This is the leadership level. So I looked at what we were going to do to get the Army back in balance. How did I communicate what our strategy was to do that? And what I did was I said, look, there's 4 things that we need to do here. We need to sustain our soldiers and family. We need to continue to prepare soldiers for success in the current conflict. We need to reset them to bring them back to their pre-combat levels when they return. And we need to continue to transform for an uncertain future. SPRT. So now every time they saw KC, they got back in balance in SPRT. And that's inside the Army, on the Hill. I mean, I would speak across 10 or 15 times a month, I'd speak to an audience. And they got back in balance in SPRT every time. 4 years later, the Army was in a fundamentally different and better position because we had the focus and we drove that through, and it began with the vision and the strategy. Second, building consensus. Everybody thinks that 4-star generals just sit in their office and say, I think today that we are going to do X. And everybody says, oh, thank you, General, and they all run out and do it. Not at all. In fact, there were days when I thought I spent more time developing consensus for the vision and the strategy than I did in developing the vision and the strategy. I mean, you've all seen great ideas come screaming through your organization, right? Oh, what a great idea. How could anyone ever be opposed to that? And what happens? It gets to the next level, smacks into a wall, right? Nobody built a consensus. What I found was that I had to build consensus down, up, and across, not just inside the organization. So I started with my staff, And there's an old Army adage that says, before you can impose your will on the enemy, you have to impose it on your staff. And your staff doesn't fight you, but they try to get it into their heads. And so what would happen is we'd have interactions. And I would articulate what I was seeing. I'd describe the situation to them and what I wanted done. And then they'd go away and think about it and come back, and they'd feed back to me. And what I normally found, they'd get about a 75% solution the first time. So I'd be even more articulate, sometimes even surprising myself, and give them more guidance. And they'd go back and they'd come back. But it was an iterative process. But what I found, it was a great use of my time, because once they got it in their heads, they became my disciples to go out and spread the word. And then I'd give orders and directions to my subordinate commanders, and they'd brief me back on that. And that's how we began getting the internal organization on board. And oh, by the way, when they speak to external organizations, it helps if they're all saying the same thing and they have the same vision. Across. So you need to pay attention. As a leader, I found, you need to pay attention to people who are outside your organization, not under your direct control, but who can influence a decision positively or negatively. And so I had to get the Army Secretary, the Army Secretariat on board with this, and I had to get the other service chiefs on board. One of the things, an example I'll use is one of the things we needed to do with the Army was to accelerate the growth of the Army. And this is in 2007, and I go out to see audiences, like this, of soldiers and families, and I said, yes, the Army's going to grow, because we made a decision to increase the size of the Army by 65,000 in 2007. And we're going to be done by 2012. And they're looking at me, just having come back from their last deployment, looking at another one, and they're saying, 2012? And so I went to the Secretary of Defense and said, we need to accelerate the growth of the Army. But it was going to cost $1 billion or so for us to enable us to do that. So I had to go to the other service chiefs, and I say, hey, guys, I have to do this, and I need your support. Well, it's got to come from someplace. But they could have killed it. So across, you have to build consensus across. And then lastly, you got to build consensus up. And what I found is, when you're going into a meeting for a decision, you better have set the conditions so the decision is already made before you walk in the door. And when I wanted to get this acceleration done, I went to the chairman and the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I got them on board. I went to the OSD staff, to the comptroller, and I got them on board. I went to the Deputy Secretary of Defense, who was violently opposed to this, and I didn't get him on board, but at least we knew where we stood. And then we went in and saw the Secretary of Defense, and he approved it. And of all the things we did, accelerating their growth was probably one of the smartest things that we did. But it was a lot of personal effort on the leader's part, on my part, to build the consensus to make that happen. But that's what leaders do. They set the conditions for the success of their organization. Building the team. It's the leader's job to build the team. And I had the great good fortune as a young man to work for one of the greatest team builders, I think, in American history, Vince Lombardi. And Vince, after he left the Packers, came to the Redskins for a year, and I just happened to be a equipment manager for the Redskins. I specialized in socks, jocks, and T-shirts. But I had the opportunity to work with and watch Vince Lombardi. And a few, 10 years or so ago, I read his autobiography. And I was struck by the description of the Ice Bowl. Now, some of the gray hairs here will remember December 31st, 1967, Green Bay, Wisconsin. The Flash and Dash, Dallas Cowboys, America's team, Bob Hayes, world's fastest human, Dandy Don Meredith, Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders, playing the old, stodgy Green Bay Packers, whose best play was the power sweep. And the temperature at kickoff was -17, the wind chill was -30, the field was frozen. You know how when your kids are wearing cleats and they're walking on concrete and it goes clack, 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 clack? That's what they said it sounded like when the players were running down the field. It was so cold. It's a desultory game. Goes back and forth. The Packers get the ball on their own 46. 4 minutes and 50 seconds left to go in the game, down by 3. Bart Starr brings them into the huddle. And it's fascinating the way the author describes it. Everybody in that huddle knew that they were going to win. That Lombardi had built such an ethos into that team that against the best opponent in the world, under the most arduous conditions, this team knew that they could impose their will. And it wasn't false bravado, because then they began a drive that marched all the way down the field and scored on the last play of the game to win, and they never discussed kicking a field goal to tie. Now, what's it take to build a team like that? And I thought back to myself and what I learned from that, and I tried to do 4 things in every organization. And at different levels, I did them differently, but it all kind of came around these 4 things. And I drew a lot of those lessons from watching Vince Lombardi work. First of all, I focused the organization on achieving excellence in the most important elements of our mission. And that takes some thought. What are the things that our organizations has to do best to succeed? When I got back from Iraq to the Army, we had ballooned the number of basic training tasks from like 30 to 60, because people were always coming back with good ideas from Iraq that they needed to do. But what was happening, you had the same amount of time. So what you did was you diluted everything to get these tasks in there. And for example, the task on the 50 caliber machine gun, there'd be a machine gun there. The soldier would come up, sit down behind it, pull the trigger, boom, boom, go on to the next station. That checked the block, it didn't do anything. We forced ourselves to go back and say, what do we really need our soldiers to be able to do well? And we did that and cut it back in half. And we were getting better output out of the soldiers coming through there. But we focused on achieving excellence in the most important part of the mission. Secondly, I'm a big standards person. If you don't establish a standard, people will do it the way they want to do it. So if you establish standards for those most important things, people have a common view of what you want them to accomplish. And they have something to focus on. You have to give them a bar to shoot for. Third, I developed reward and recognition programs to focus on achieving those standards. Napoleon had it right. It's amazing what people will do for a little piece of ribbon or a certificate. And lastly, I tried to have a little fun doing what we're doing, and have a little fun outside of work to bring people together. It's the leader's job to build a team. It's the leader's job to make everybody in that organization feel like they are an integral and contributing part of a winning team. And when you have that, it's amazing what you can do. Watch this March Madness here. You'll see the power of a team. Fourth, identifying opportunities and driving change. How do you have vision? They always used to have a major that the staff would stick with me when I'd be traveling around, because they'd say I had these epiphanies. I'd be out there looking at something, and I'd come back and say, aha! I found you need triggers to help you identify opportunities. As a leader, especially in complex environments, you're always rolling things around in your head. You're always receiving new inputs from what you're reading, from what you're seeing, from the people that you're talking to. And you have to figure out a way to wrap all that together so that you can say, aha, I think I have an opportunity here. or this is going to be a challenge for us down the way. It's a leader's job to set up the organization for success in the future. Success happens in the future. If it happens on the past, people they thank you for it, and they're already on to something else. So you have to be able to identify an opportunity. One of the ways that I found helped me inside the organization was setting up some metrics that were tied to our measures of performance, to those standards that I talked about earlier. And I wrestled hard with this in Iraq, and it took me a year before I was comfortable with the metrics that we were using to report on, because staffs will report on what they can, not necessarily what you need. And it wasn't until I forced folks to focus on 3 questions that I started getting better clarity on the outputs of the metrics. The first is, what are we trying to accomplish? The second was, how do we measure that? And the third, the second is, what will tell us if we're accomplishing that? And the third is, how do we measure it? Once we did that on our key, most important elements, we started getting good feedback, and I felt like I had a much better ability to anticipate. Now, let me give you an example of that, and then how it bumped up against organizational culture. Because the leader can see an opportunity and direct change, but if it's really significant change, it's going to bump up against established organizational culture. None of you all work in bureaucracies, so you won't have any idea about that. So, and I think this is a fairly timely analogy. But back in 2008, I started looking at what I thought would be the projected funding profile for the Army. So this is, I've been on the ground about 9 months. And I had the staff draw up, I said, go back and look at the history of funding since World War II. Government funding and defense spending. Well, guess what? Just like that. And almost, it was almost perfect. It was almost a perfect sine wave. And so what that told me was that we were at the top of a curve, and we were going to start trending down pretty soon. I didn't know if it was going to happen on my watch, but it was going to happen pretty soon. And so I started looking at how we were postured for that. One second here, if I can. Trying to get rid of a little cold here. I started looking at how we were prepared to deal with that. And what I found was we're not ready. First of all, the mindset. The Army budget went from $78 billion on September 11th to $254 billion in 2008. That's a huge jump. And I still had generals walking into my office saying, Chief, in this time of constrained resources, I'd say, what are you talking about? If we can't run the Army on $250 billion a year, they ought to fire us. Which led me to another problem, which was the way we develop budgets. And the budgets are developed in what? Silos, right? And there is a third problem, and that's requirements. The requirements also come up through silos. So the combination of the two is you have pressures, the pressures are always up. Requirements always go up, they rarely go down. And I was confused why people were telling me that they had all these requirements they couldn't meet. How could you have unfunded requirements when you're getting $250 billion a year? But that's what this budget process and the programming process and the silos drive you to. And I found that I was having a difficult time making hard decisions about where to put the Army's money because I thought this was all smoke and mirrors. And the other nice thing about the budget silos, there's no sharing. It's all, the competition takes place within the silo, right? And if you get more money for your silo in the process, what do you get? High fives. If you're more efficient, what do you get? Yeah, thank you very much. When I was a two-star commander in Germany, the staff came in to me and said, "We have $1 million left at the end of the year, General." And I said, "Well, great, let's give it back." You can't do that. They'll dock us in next year's budget. I said, "Look, I'm just not going to throw it out there and let people fill up their supply cabinets." So I very proudly went in and said, "There you go, General, $1 million. He looked at me, "Well, thank you." And they docked me $1 million off of next year's budget. Now, you think I did that again? But there's no positive incentive to be efficient. And it's what I found as we tried to work our way through this, there's not a good way to share things, to share efficiencies in one silo with another where you want to put it. So it's all working against you. So I figured I had to break down this culture and this mindset within the Army if we were going to be successful. Otherwise, the future Army leadership wasn't going to be able to make intelligent decisions when something, who knew, like sequestration came in. I mean, I never heard of the word sequestration, but I knew it was going to come down. We just didn't know how far and how fast. But we had to change the mindset. So I started sending generals to business school at the University of North Carolina in 2008. And as I went down there, I started seeing the culture I was pushing up against. And I said, "Look, you all are a part of the 300 leaders of the Army that you need to help me run the Army." And rather than just bringing in decisions to me and said, "Chief, here's the problem, here's the issue, you figure out where the money comes from," I want you all to look at the Army as an enterprise and not as a group of silos. And I want you to help me make intelligent decisions about where we can best control our costs and make good decisions. Well, I could see the people. They didn't like the idea of talking about costs while we had soldiers at war. That made them uncomfortable. So I shifted gears a little bit. And I started talking about value. Oh, value. We can get our arms around value. And how do you get the most bang for the buck? Not just how do you get the most expensive thing out there. So people, they started getting more comfortable with value. And from value came efficiency. And we started to push this enterprise approach across the Army. I'll tell you, I got real friction. And the interesting thing was, it came mostly from the civilian side. Because the civilian side saw it as a green suit takeover of their prerogatives. And I kept trying to explain to them, look, the green suiters are the requirements generators. In the Army, 70% of the colonel's billets are in the operational force. The guys that say, "I want, I need." 70% of the general officer billets are in the institutional side of the Army, the business side of the Army, the ones that try to figure out how to do the budget. And so I had to figure out how to change the mindset of the green suiters if the civilians would have any chance of success. And we worked through that. I said I had limited success. We actually were able to get through the first tranche of budget cuts without having to reduce our end strength, which at that time was very important for us, because if in 2010, before we were out of Iraq, we announced we were cutting the size of the Army, that would have had a huge impact on the men and women of the armed forces. So you're out there right now today, if you're working with or in the government, and you're wrestling with some significant and fundamental change because of the budget environment and because of the world that's evolving around us. And you're not going to solve it by doing the same things at lower levels. I was thinking coming in here, I don't have any insights into the ongoing budget discussions in the Pentagon. But I just bet that as people are looking at the program, they're looking at previous year plus inflation going out over the program. Huh? I just bet that's the case. Maybe flatline, I don't know. But I just bet the assumptions in the out years are previous year plus inflation. Just between us, it's not going to happen. And it's going to take leaders to lead pretty significant and fundamental change within the government if we're going to continue to do the things that we need to do to go forward as a country. Fifth point, communicate. Leader is the face of the organization, inside and outside the organization. When I went around, before I took my job as Army Chief, I talked to all my predecessors. And the one thing they told me is, Chief, you're going to get tired of hearing yourself talk. You're going to get tired of hearing yourself say the same thing. And as I said, I talk 10, 15 times a month around inside and outside the Army, and I said, back in balance, SPRT, this is the Army. But that's what you have to do as a leader to get your message out. Message, audience, frequency. What's your message? Tailor it to the right audience, and then slam it home. One press conference does not a message make. Message, audience, frequency. The other part of this is good things happen, bad things happen in good and great organizations. They just do. And when they happen, the people inside and the outside the organization need to see the leader's face. They need to see the leader out there taking action and doing the right things. Probably the most difficult day that I had, or the difficult period I had as the Army Chief of Staff, was after the 5th of November 2009, where 13 soldiers were murdered at Fort Hood, Texas. The next day, the Secretary of the Army and I, John McHugh, got on a plane and flew to Fort Hood. And we met with the families of the soldiers that were killed. We met with the people who were involved in the incidents. We conducted several press conferences. In fact, I don't know if any of you all have been to Fort Hood, Texas, but there's a big headquarters building out there, and then there's a big open field. And the satellite trucks created like an amphitheater from all the different networks out there. And in between the trucks were all the reporters, and there was a podium about this big, good-sized podium, that there were so many microphones on that you could not even put a 3x5 card on it. But the American people and the soldiers and families of the Army need to hear from the Secretary of the Army and I that they were going to be okay and that we were on top of it and we were investigating it. I came back, did about 3 Sunday talk shows, went back with the President a few days later and did the memorial service. But we had to get the message out to our soldiers and families they were going to be safe at home and that we were going to take appropriate action. It's hard, but it's essential. Communications. And then lastly, you have to sustain yourself. The complexities of these environments require leaders that are intellectually, emotionally, and physically sharp. The older I got, the more I realized that how less sharp I was when I was tired. And I'm much sharper at 7 o'clock in the morning than I am at 11 o'clock at night. It's just the way it is. Now, you young folks can take that 5-hour energy and go on forever, but it catches up with you. So I found what I used to tell every leader coming into Iraq, and I started doing this when I was a division commander with folks who were going into Kosovo, and it's things I learned from myself when I was a brigadier in Bosnia. That leaders in tough environments need to find time every day to read, exercise, sleep, and think. And if you don't do that, you won't have the productive insights that will guide your organization in difficult periods. Read. You have to read something besides your email, your inbox, and the intelligence is what I used to tell them. What what I find is you have to read something from outside of what you're doing, right? You all know when you're reading a book about something completely unrelated to what you're doing, you get flashes and insights into what you're working on, and they help you see it clearer. You have to find time to read. In Iraq, I used to read myself to sleep every night, and I found it had the added benefit of helping to slow down my mind, which was spinning with the events of the day, so I could actually get some sleep. But read. Exercise. I used to tell these leaders that you have to get yourself on an exercise regimen. Strong bodies really do fuel strong minds. It does. And so and I tell this to every colonel coming in. I go out and meet with every brigade coming in. And then I go visit them 30 days later. And I can't tell you how many of the sergeants major would come up and they'd pull on my sleeve and they'd say, "General, the colonel's not doing what you told him." And he didn't have to tell me. I'd look at the colonel, and the colonel looked like a bag of doo-doo. But the good ones got themselves on an exercise regimen and sustained themselves through it. I worked out 4 or 5 days a week in Iraq, and I also found out it was a pretty good way to burn off frustrations. Sleep. You got to get your rest. I find that the men and women of the American Armed Forces push themselves too hard. They will work 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, if you let them. And what happens is they just progressively wear themselves down, and their insights get duller and duller. You have to get your rest. Sleep is personal. I need 6 or 7 hours a night to function effectively, so I got it. But it's personal, and you need to get your rest. And lastly, probably most importantly, is think. You have to find time daily and periodically to think, to organize your thoughts about what's going on. And if you don't do that, when you're called on to provide direction or guidance, you wing it. And you all know how clear the guidance always is from your boss, right? Well, talking to a big organization like the Army, if I wasn't clear and they walked out of my office, God knows what would have happened. So I tried to be as clear as I could, and I found to do that, I needed to spend time daily organizing myself for the day, organizing myself for the short term. And as Army Chief of Staff, I would stay at my quarters. I'd get up about 6 and read some intelligence and start organizing myself, and I'd go to work at 8:30. Because once I walked into work, there was no time to think. It was like someone had painted a big target on me. Everybody wanted a piece of the action, so I was bing, 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 very little chance to think. And then I found I had to find some private time periodically, weekly, monthly, to think about the long term, to think about what we wanted to get done, how we were doing in getting it done, and what we needed to change or adapt so that we were going to be successful in the future. In Iraq, I started taking off a day a month. And I'd just stay over at my quarters, I'd read some reports, and then I'd write something about the future direction of the mission. I wound up taking that to like a half a day every week, because I just needed more time. But leaders need private time to think and organize their thoughts. So, if you're going to be physically, mentally, and emotionally fit enough to lead in this VUCA world, you have to take care of yourself. Now let me just wrap up, and then I'll be happy to take questions about whatever you all want to talk about. But I want to wrap up with a quote. And it's a quote that what has been my favorite quote for a long time. But when I walked into my desk, my office as the Chief of Staff of the Army, there's this grand old wooden desk that was made it came out of the War Department right at the turn of the 20th century. About 1903, I think it was made. And it was completely clear, and under the glass was a 3x5 card. And it had been left there for me from my predecessor. And it was striking because, there weren't stacks of briefing books, there weren't memos, there was just this one 3x5 card. And the title of the card was Boldness. And here's the quote, and I'm sure you've heard it. But it's not the critic that counts. It's not the one who points out how the strong one stumbles or the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the one who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred with dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who often comes up short again and again, and who, if at best, in the end, knows the value of high achievement and the great devotions, and who, if at worst, if they fail, at least fail while daring greatly, so that their soul will never be counted among those cold and timid ones that know neither victory nor defeat. Theodore Roosevelt. Think about that. Dare great things as you go forward, and above all, believe in yourselves. So good luck to you, and I'm happy to take questions about whatever you want to talk about. Excuse me.
Sir, thank you very much.
Excuse me. Cleaning up here.
We're going to use two microphones, one on each side. We've got one over on this side and one over there with Andreas. So if you'd like, the easiest way is we'll alternate between mics. Whichever one is convenient for you, please step forward. Sir, I get the first question as people are getting organized. What do you know today that you wish you knew 6 months or a year after you started your military career? So what advice would you give to these young folks that they can take away?
I just did.
There are many good points.
Well, I mean, you know, you grow so much. I mean, gosh. I mean, I think about walking in the door to my first unit in 1970. 1971 was when I actually got to my first unit. I didn't know anything. But you know, the Army has a process that increasingly develops you and increasingly prepares you to operate at higher and higher levels. And the other thing I tried to do was I didn't shy away from the hard jobs. In fact, I actively sought out and took the hard jobs. One, because I like challenges, but two, to better prepare me for when I was put in a position to lead. And you know, it's interesting. If you think about it, I came in just as Vietnam was winding down, and I didn't go to Vietnam. And for the period, for really the first 30 years that I was in the Army, we were focused on defeating the Warsaw Pact. That was the greatest threat, or North Korea. It was a very conventional threat. And we got very good at that. I got very good at that. But then the war I got thrust in to lead was a completely different kind of war. In fact, it was a war that the Army hadn't had to deal with for over 4 decades. But that's the bane of a military officer's existence. You can't pick your war. And so I was able to adjust and adapt, and the Army and all the services were able to adjust and adapt to a different form of war while we were fighting it. And I believe that I was able to make that adaptation because I was firmly grounded in the basic skills that the Army had instilled in me growing up. And the last thing I tell you is never pass up the opportunity to lead.
Sir, we have a question. Good morning, everybody. My question has to deal with mentorship. Who in your life did you talk to, could you have a cup of coffee with, have a beer with, that didn't have the agenda of, as you came up in the ranks, but cared about George Casey? Who did you talk to and bounce ideas off of?
It's interesting. I get that question all the time. I'll start from the back end. As the Chief of Staff, even 4-stars need mentors. And I was blessed to have a couple of former chiefs who live in the local area who I'd go out and just sit down and have lunch with, dinner with, about once every 4 to 6 months. And they'd let me talk. And they always had some really sharp insights. But you know, it wasn't like you read about in the papers a lot that the old generals are trying to squeeze the new generals. It was, they helped. And that is, growing up over time, I had a series of folks, and it really, it wasn't until I was like a lieutenant colonel, kind of mid-level officer, that I actually started picking folks. Up to that time, I looked at people who I thought were good examples. And I tried to model myself on those people. And I watched how they acted and not what they said. But as I got to the lieutenant colonel level, I think it's probably because the problems got harder and more complex, I started reaching out to folks and talking to them. And I'm an infantry guy. And for some reason, all my mentors were armor guys. And part of it was because I was mechanized infantry. But, you know, guys like Jerry Bartlett, Wes Clark, John Abrams, John Tallelli. Those were folks that I tried to model myself after, and I sought out guidance and direction from. And they helped me. So that's kind of how it came out. And I think it had more to do, I had to, before I went to somebody, I had to respect them. And then, you know, they were always willing to help.
Time for 2 or 3 more questions. I have one question here on the side as well.
General, what were the most successful techniques specifically that you used to manage upward to achieve what you thought was right, your position?
The technique that I used that I think is the most essential is you got to have direct contact, face-to-face contact with that boss. And you've got to be able to articulate to them clearly and succinctly in a way that they can understand and fit into their environment what it is you need and what it is you want them to do. Talking to the big boss is always hard, especially if you're going to ask them for something that you know they don't want. And it's, again, inaction. It's easier to do nothing sometimes. But it's a fight. You know, in any big bureaucracy, it's all about money. It's all about resources. You got to go out and fight the fight. I'll give you an example. You go through the budget process and it gets ready to go, and then they have this big meeting where all the services and all the Department of Defense staff come, and they all sit around a big table. And so this is one where all the issues were supposed to have been worked out before you get there. And it was just to say, you know, to give everybody the last chance. And nobody ever says anything. So we go to this meeting, and the staff had come running into me the night before and said, "Sir, they're screwing us. They just took $3 million out of the Army budget. We can't, the world will end tomorrow as we know it. You got to go in and you got to fight for that." So the next morning, we're all sitting around the table, and Secretary Gates comes in, opening comments, and he says, "Does anyone have any issues?" And I felt a little bit like Oliver Twist. More? You want more? So I made my case. And then when I stopped talking, nobody said a word. Nobody said anything. And there was this long pause. And then the briefer says, "Next slide." And I said, "Wait a minute." and Secretary Gates, to his credit, said, "I hear you, George." And the next, you know, we went next morning, we get these calls, and we got half of it back. So I went back to the staff. This is a good lesson for me. I went back to the staff, and I said, "Well, guys, I'm sorry. I did my best, but I only got $1.5 billion back." "Oh, that's okay." I said, "What are you talking about? It's okay. You just told me the world was going to end." And I was very, very careful after that. But you got to be able to go out and deal with the boss. That's where you make your inroads. And you got to be able to make your case to the boss.
Sir, we have a question here.
Hi, so clearly you've been through a lot of training and education, but what books on leadership have you read that you've said, well, that's got it? Because I'd like to go read a couple of them, you know?
Well,
I'm not in the Army. They're not going to train me for 20 years, so.
He wants the short route.
trained me for 40. Interesting. I tell you, I just wrote a book about my time in Iraq, and the last chapter is Insights for Leaders. And a lot of what I just said here today is in that book. But what's interesting to me, especially for leaders at the strategic level who aspire to be at the strategic level, you know the book that I gave to generals? Path Between the Seas. And it's David McCullough's book about the building of the Panama Canal. And it's a story of broad vision, of failed vision, and it's magnificent. I mean, Ferdinand de Lesseps, the great builder of the Suez Canal, had this vision to build a canal across the isthmus there in Panama. But he was resting on his past successes, and didn't go out and lead the effort. So he didn't get the resources behind it, and he didn't build the consensus for it, and he failed miserably. But Theodore Roosevelt came along and realized that if we were going to be a global power, we need to be able to move our naval forces from one sea to the other. And he figured out how to do it. And he got a good Army doctor and a good Army engineer, and they figured it out. It's a wonderful story about the impact that leadership can have. So that's my favorite one for strategic level leaders.
We have two more, one over there.
First, I'd like to thank you for just an absolutely wonderful presentation, very helpful, a lot of good insights, and so thank you for sharing those with us.
Thank you. I always find that when I get compliments, the question's really hard. Go ahead, Susan.
You mentioned building consensus, and I certainly agree with you. That's a very important thing to do. The challenge is in most of our leadership roles, we are so busy with the day-to-day grind of, you mentioned a target on your back, and trying to get through the day with all your meetings and getting everything accomplished. How did you find the time to meet with people, build consensus, and still get your job done?
Yeah, you have to be the master of your own schedule. I mean, and you have to figure out, that's this quiet time to think, what are the most important things that I have to get done in the next 3 weeks or 6 months, whatever. And then you build your own strategy about this is how I need to do it. And so, you know, I knew I was going to go in and ask to accelerate the growth of the Army, and it was going to take me, I figured, 3 months to build the consensus for it. And so I started lining up luncheons and briefings and going around and seeing people. And but it took me that long, probably 2 or 3 months to be able to do that. But you have to be the master of your own calendar. And there were times where I said, nope, sorry, not going to do that. You know, you all know, it's so hard to get consumed by the daily stuff that's not really important. And, you know, I think back now of the things I thought were crises when I was a lieutenant colonel. I don't even remember them, let alone anybody else. Focus on the big picture.
So we got one more right.
First team, sir. I did 2 NTC rotations with you, and you gave your speech before the rotation. You got the staff together, and you talked about the excellence in the mission, doing the good things right, and talking about setting standards and awards and having fun. So my question is, what happened to the flat-ass rules? Do you remember those when we talked to, you had your flat-ass rules, the
I did.
stickers and all those things?
Flat-ass rules, right? It's an old cavalry tradition. But what it really is, it's a leader's way of focusing their subordinates on the most important things that they want them to do, that they need to do to succeed. So flat-ass rules were my way of focusing my subordinates on the never more than 10. But that 7 to 10 things that they really had to do well if we were going to succeed. So I had flat-ass rules as lieutenant colonel. I had flat-ass rules going into Kosovo, and I had flat-ass rules in Iraq. I didn't get the flat-ass rules in the Army, but I probably should have. But it's a way of focusing folks on the most important elements. And what I found is, if the leader doesn't tell people what the most important things are, they don't know. They're out there doing what it is to survive on a daily basis.
Sir, thank you
Let
very,
me,
very much.
thanks. Let me just say one thing. That, you know, you're gonna, the budget's going down, okay? It is. And it's gonna take folks to lead and to figure out how to use the money that's been given to the government as efficiently and effectively as possible. And I know this is called FedBid Fuel, but if someone had come to me and said, we have a way with reverse auction to save 10 to 15% on every purchase, I would have made everybody do it. But yet there's still friction. And if you can help lead change in your organizations to make them more efficient and more effective, I think that's a good thing for everybody. So thanks very much. Great to spend some time with you. Thanks.